Before we jump in, I have to explain a bit about what we're focusing on in this video. I really want to look at new and upcoming motorcycles, not just updates to certain bikes. So for example, we're not going to be looking at the chrome editions of the Bonneville lineup that still somehow does not have as much chrome as the original Bonnevilles, but also it's really not a new motorcycle in any regard. Same goes for updates to the Ducati Scrambler. You know, there's probably a new paint scheme for the W800. I could probably pat the time in this video by talking about like 15 different motorcycles, but I really just want to talk about the new stuff. I'm also not going to talk about the 1000cc version of the Super Veloce. Technically that is a new bike, but it is a limited edition run that's like 50 grand or something. But also for me, the true nature of the original Super Veloce in its sort of 60s race bike styling, well, much of that retro feel is kind of lost for me with this version. It sort of just looks like whatever a new F4 would look like. So, you know, pretty cool. Makes like 208 horsepower. I think it'd be cool if they somehow had eked out a few more horsepower so that it was a little faster than the hyper sort of street bikes that they have with that platform. So yeah, with all of that sort of out of the way, I've got 6 new motorcycles for us to look at from EICMA 2022. So let's jump right in and check them out. Okay, let's start with the Fantic Caballero 700. Now, Fantic is an Italian manufacturer with a pretty long history, but they've had a sort of resurgence in the last few years in the West. Now, the Caballero 500 has been around for a bit, but this is the new Caballero 700, and it's powered by Yamaha's fantastic twin that's in, for example, the T7. Really just an awesome engine, great for this kind of bike in my opinion also. Now this bike has an awesome stripped back sort of modern scrambler look with a really fantastic level of quality. The fit and finish and overall the specs, all of it just looks really great. You've got that T7 engine producing 75 horsepower, Brembo brakes, really low weight, under 400 pounds, and a target price of 10,000 pounds. Now, the Caballero is an iconic name from Fantic's history, and of course, this bike doesn't really have any real tie to that bike beyond, you know, the red paint, and I guess the fact that it is kind of a scrambler, but of course it's more of just a styling exercise, which is true for a lot of these retro bikes. I don't think people are taking this bike off-road, for example. Regardless, this is a really beautiful, stylish, retro scrambler, and I think it's great to see another Italian company making waves in the industry, and maybe Fantic will be able to grow and get to the point where they're sort of producing everything in-house and sort of running independently versus using other people's engines. But as you'll see with a lot of bikes on this list, that's pretty common for a lot of these companies, and I don't have a problem with it. All right, next we have the Hesketh Heresy 450, a new bike from a really interesting company. The Hesketh name was bought in 2010. This is an old British company, and since then they've been building new models and making updates. Now, like most startups, essentially they can't just go out and invest millions into building a new engine. This bike, for example, is a built-to-spec single made in Taiwan. Essentially, it's an XR400 motocross engine with some tweaks. Now, what's interesting about a bike like this is it doesn't really know whether it's classic or modern. On the one hand, you have this thoroughly Japanese-looking air-cooled engine that does look very classic. It doesn't look British classic, I will say, but it does look retro. But then it feels very techy with, you know, lots of carbon fiber and modern suspension. I have to say, though, in this black paint, when you take a step back and really look at it, the package as a whole is really nice. It has a very sort of early 2000s Honda street bike for me for some reason. But that underswept exhaust on a retro bike, I don't know, a lot of those things are pretty cool touches. Now at 14,000 pounds, and I'm not talking about the weight, I'm talking about the price, it's still probably way out of most riders' price range. In many ways, it is a collector's bike. You know, it only produces between 30 and 40 horsepower. I mean, you could buy so many unbelievable bikes at that price and get way more for your dollar, and this is really more of a beginner bike. But that's not really the market for a bike like this, and this is how companies get off the ground, you know? Tough sell, but, you know, really cool overall, lots of hand-built features, including the frame, which is actually pretty awesome to see. This really is a brand to keep an eye on. I do believe that brands can get themselves off the ground with this overall strategy, and, you know, we'll have to see what comes from Hesketh, but regardless, pretty cool new bike from them. Okay, next we have the new Honda CL500. Now, if you know Honda's history, you know CL was a designation for Honda's Scrambler offerings. I'm sure many of you have heard of Honda's iconic CB. Well, the CL was essentially a CB with high pipes. You know, just like scramblers today are mainly regular street bikes with maybe different tires and upswept exhaust, the CL is obviously, at least in name, what Honda is pointing to with this new bike. My dad actually has a Honda CL 350. These bikes don't really look much like each other except for that exhaust. But more than anything, this is a smart way to capitalize on Honda's popular Rebel 500 platform with a different kind of style, and they did a great job of taking the Rebel 500 and making it more of a scrambler sort of retro bike. Beginner riders do like cruisers, but they're also very much into classic bikes and retro looking bikes. So having, you know, one of the big manufacturers like Honda and all that comes with, you know, owning a Honda in terms of reliability and service and affordability, yeah, making this bike is just kind of awesome. Now, I personally don't think it's retro enough. I wish Honda would just make an actual retro bike that actually looked like one of their old CBs. If Honda made a CB 500 that actually looked like exactly like one of their classic CB 500s, they would kill it. They would absolutely wreck the entire retro bike market. But you know, this bike is sort of on brand with Honda's current design language, and for me, it just doesn't have enough of a retro or scrambler feel. It just kind of feels like someone took a Rebel and made a few customizations, and you know, that's just personal. I'm sure lots of riders will be happy to own this bike, and I'm guessing it will be probably a pretty big success for Honda. But really quick, while we're talking about Honda, I should also mention that Honda had a few other technically retro offerings this year, with the Hornet and the Transalp being unveiled. Now, in ways, these bikes are pointing back to, you know, older models, just not the traditional styles we think of when we think of retro motorcycles. So, you know, the Dakar style of the Transalp, and then the early 2000s street bikes that the Hornet is obviously pointing to. It doesn't look super retro, and obviously it isn't old enough looking for many of you guys, but technically speaking, these are kind of retro bikes. But anyways, just thought you should know about those, and obviously the CL500 is a bike to look out for. Now, the next bike I want to talk about is a new offering from Mutt Motorcycles, that awesome British company making somewhat custom looking retro-ish smaller displacement motorcycles, mainly 125 and 250s. These are the bikes that you wish you could get as a beginner rider in the UK, as you're limited to certain capacities, but you know, you usually end up with something like this. Now, Mutt's bikes are like many smaller startup companies. They rep other companies' engines. I believe Mutt's use Suzuki GN singles, just simple, reliable, little air-cooled engines. Now, this new bike coming out in 2023 is the Drk01 series, and this is a different kind of motorcycle for Mutt. This is the first time a Mutt motorcycle will have a liquid-cooled engine. Now, this isn't an in-house engine, which is fine. Not sure exactly where it comes from, but it's more competitive as a little single. You've got more power, and this bike will have things like LED lights and a 6-speed gearbox. Now, I don't have loads of details, but the point is, it's an even more competitive offering from one of the coolest British motorcycle companies out there. Mutt just gets it in terms of style. They just get what people want. Also, their bikes sound amazing. Now, this line will eclipse the 250cc mark for the first time for Mutt. So this is bigger, faster, more competitive, and hopefully competitively priced. Hopefully this thing isn't like 10,000 pounds or something ridiculous. But, you know, Mutts have always seemed pretty reasonable in price, so I don't think that'll be the case, but definitely a cool bike to be on the lookout for. For number 2, no surprise here, Royal Enfield unveiled their new Super Meteor 650. For some, this isn't exactly retro in the way that, for example, the Interceptor is, and it's true, but this is really just a better stab at the cruiser market than the previous Meteor, and obviously cruisers are retro in nature. This bike makes so much more sense for Royal Enfield than the Meteor 350, but by its very nature as a cruiser and its overall styling, you know, it is retro. Now, the idea is simple. Take the Meteor 350 concept and bring it to the bigger twin platform. Now, the only problem I have with this is that the Interceptor and Continental GT are not exactly cruiser-ish in their power delivery. They aren't like torque machines the way that, say, Triumph's modern classic line is. It's much easier to turn a T100 or a T120 into a cruiser, as we've seen already, because those are already relatively torquey machines, and it doesn't appear as though this thing has been tuned any differently than the twins. You know, personally, I would rather see maybe a little less horsepower, but a little bit more torque, or maybe have the power produced at the lower end of the rev range, because again, these engines, these twins are just not torquey. But in terms of styling, I mean, seems like they totally nailed it, honestly. This looks like a baby Harley, arguably the bike that Harley should have already made. And you know it's going to be way more affordable than anything Harley or Indian have to offer. They've also given it the proper riding stance. Again, just a knockout bike from Royal Enfield, one of the only companies who really seems to have a real pulse on the current market, just making great, awesome looking, simple, fun bikes that are affordable. You'd think that that wouldn't be that hard, but for some reason other manufacturers don't get this. Again, why can't Honda make a bike like this? I just don't get it. Everything is so plastic, so boring, while everything Royal Enfield makes looks classic and beautiful and everybody likes it. So if you're one of the major manufacturers out there, take a step back and make a freaking Royal Enfield. Even the CL500 we looked at, it just feels so much more corporate and uninteresting compared to a bike like this. Now, I'm not a huge cruiser guy, but man, you don't have to be a cruiser guy to see how cool this bike looks. So maybe that's the real genius of Royal Enfield at this point. Last on our list is one of the more audacious, but also thoroughly MV Augusta-esque bikes, the MV Augusta 921S concept bike. Now, this bike really stole the show for many who went, and what's so interesting is this bike has an all-new 921cc inline-4 engine, repping a weirdly low 114 horsepower. I guess it'll be just an absolute torque monster, because I can't remember the last time MV Augusta made an inline-4 that didn't produce less than like 200 horsepower. I mean, the original F4 from 1999 was like 750 cc's and made 130-ish horsepower. So not sure what's going on, but regardless, this is such a striking motorcycle, really designed to mimic the original 73 750S with that American paint scheme. Okay guys, I actually just went and started reading about this. I'm reading that it's going to have 86 foot-pounds of torque. That's like 20 more foot-pounds of torque than the current F3 and 10 more than the current Brutale 1000 RR. That's a ton of torque. So that's the route they've gone for, which is really cool. This will be a super fun street bike. A really torquey inline-4, I don't know, kind of weird. That's more than the current Speed Twin also, which is an unbelievably torquey machine. So you guys get the point. This will be kind of a manic machine and much quicker than anything in its class. Now, though the overall stance is sort of classic retro cafe racer bike, I mean, it looks like something you'd see going around Instagram, but when you get up close, there's lots of modern and even futuristic bits. Now, apparently the plan is to bring this to production in 2024. Who knows if that will happen? I did just see that KTM now has a big stake in MV Augusta. But I'm guessing that MV Augusta wanted to gauge the interest in this bike and see if current MV owners will want it, which I'm sure people will. It seems like everybody's talking about how cool this bike is. So would be really cool to see MV Augusta release a bike like this. I don't know how much it'll cost. It'd be nice to see it not be outlandish. So, alrighty, there you have it. 6 new retro motorcycles from EICMA 2022 that maybe you didn't catch already. Let us know what you guys think in the comments below about these bikes, or maybe some other retro bikes that you saw, or just any motorcycles that you think look cool from EICMA. And yeah, we'll see you guys in the next video. Ride safe.